Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. A quick correction from our last episode. Thank you to a listener who pointed out that I made a mistake. Astrid Lindgren and her Pippi Longstocking stories are Swedish and not Norwegian. I'm glad to have an opportunity to make that correction today because, in honor of World Kidlit Month, we're going to be discussing Japanese children's literature, the history of children's literature in general, the history of children's literature in Japan in particular, and Sachiko Kashiwaba and her Temple Alley Summer. It's a story that is about Japanese children's literature, at least a little bit. I want to make clear from the get-go that this episode is still very much relevant to you, my almost certainly adult listener, for at least two reasons that aren't. You might someday want to buy a book for a kid in your life. Number one, children's books aren't just for children. Yeah, this is a bit of a cliche, but it's worth saying again, children's books can be hugely enjoyable for adults, both for nostalgic revisits and for fresh reads. They also offer different perspectives than adult novels. For example, I've never read a book for adults that deals with death and grief, as well as some children's novels do. Temple Alley Summer is a fantastic example of a book that deals with death in some really nuanced ways. We'll talk about that a little bit more toward the end of the episode. The second reason you might want to read children's literature from Japan, particularly for fans of Japanese culture in general, is that this literature can give you a window into the world of Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli. I'm not going into that Ghibli connection too much today. I'm hoping to save that for an entire episode later this fall. I want to do something around the same time that we non-Japanese residents can finally get access to Miyazaki's most recent last film outside of Japan. Anyway, I'm going to start with the story of children's literature in Europe because Europe was the first place to have an industry of printed children's literature. Not, obviously, because Europeans were the first people to tell their children stories. I believe that's a fairly universal part of parenting and living in community with children. European and later American children's literature also had a lasting influence on Japanese children's literature. People like to trace the oldest children's stories in any literature back to that literature's folk tales and fairy tales. It's certainly true that children would have been part of the audience for those kinds of stories. Virtually everyone was a part of the audience for those kinds of stories. You sit around as a group and entertain yourselves in the evening with a nice folk tale, with a nice fairy story. But I tend to side with J.R.R. Tolkien on grouping these kinds of stories, the stories he calls fairy stories just as a broad category, with children's stories. It's bad literary history and a bad plan in general. According to Tolkien, quote, fairy stories have, in the modern lettered world, been relegated to the nursery, as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because the adults do not want it and do not mind if it is used, not, he goes on to explain, because they belong there. In other words, fairy tales aren't particularly good for kids. It's just that adults aren't especially interested in them anymore. If we're looking for text specifically for children, the earliest records only go back to the 15th century. These stories are not for children's enjoyment. One of the earliest surviving children's books in English is an English adaptation of a Latin text called Puer ad mensum, or A Boy at the Table. and the English title is The Baby's Book. It's an instruction manual for waiting at table for the lord of the manor. Many English and American children learned how to read from the King James Bible. Lucky children learned to read from chapbooks, cheaply printed editions of popular stories. And again, these weren't printed for children, but they often had the kinds of stories we associate with children today: folk tales, fairy tales. Other children were handed books like James Janeway's 1671 classic, A Token for Children, an exact account of the conversion, holy and exemplary lives, and joyful death of several young children. Believe it or not, this book sold well for over a century. One of the first big breaks for child readers was actually the work of philosopher John Locke. He's the modern Englishman who popularized the idea that children are tabula rasa, blank slates, and ought to be molded into the right kind of people. In his 1691 Thoughts on Education, he suggested that children should learn to read something, gasp, pleasant, like Aesop's fables. A generation later, a handful of publishers revolutionized books for children. And this is really why the English language is so central to the story of children's literature. It's in England that this generation of publishers does the work to make printing books for children an industry for the first time. The most celebrated of this generation of publishers is John Newbery. That name might ring a bell if you're a connoisseur of children's literature. John Newbery is the namesake of America's most coveted prize for children's literature, the Newbery Medal. We'll talk about the Newbery Medal again in just a minute. Newbery actually made most of his money selling patent medicines and publishing for adults. But he made enough money selling stories for children that he changed the game. Publishers realized people would buy stories written specifically for children. Newbery is responsible for A Pretty Little Pocketbook. It's often cited as the first book explicitly created to actually entertain children. Over the next century, publishing for children became more of an international project. Swiss author Johann David Wyss published The Swiss Family Robinson in 1812. Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen published his collection of fairy tales told for children starting in 1835. I want to pause here to take note of two things about all of the 18th and 19th century stories I've mentioned so far. One is that they have obvious lessons to teach their young readers. The Swiss Family Robinson is about family and self-reliance and manly virtue. The Little Mermaid is about sacrificial love. Many children's stories continued to have a strong moral element. The other thing I want to point out is that many Anglo-Americans don't think about stories like The Swiss Family Robinson or The Little Mermaid as translations, as a part of any culture outside of our own. For several decades, children's fiction was a more international enterprise. But today, Anglo-American children read very little in translation. And when Anglo-American children do read in translation, they often still don't realize they're reading a translation. I mentioned Astrid Lindgren and Pippi Longstocking, although again I got the language wrong. It was written in Swedish. I suppose many people do realize Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince was translated from French, though almost no one knows that it was translated by Richard Howard. And this is true even of more recent fiction. Marcus Pfister's The Rainbow Fish was originally written in German, translated by J. Allison James. Michael Ende's The Never-Ending Story was translated from German by Ralph Mannheim, and Cornelia Funke's Inkheart was translated from German by Anthea Bell. 1865 was a game-changing year. It's the year Charles Dodgson, a.k.a. Lewis Carroll, published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Alice was the first widely read work of children's literature that was pure, delightful nonsense. no morals to teach, more or less nothing educational, just fun. In case you're wondering, the first Japanese translations of Alice appeared shortly after 1900. It was really only after Alice that we get original works of pure fantasy written specifically for children, and especially books about leaving our world and escaping into a fantasy world. The post-Alice late 19th century is regarded as a golden age of children's literature. From Britain, Robert Louis Stevenson's classics like Treasure Island, Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, and Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Little Princess. From the U.S., Louisa May Alcott's Little Women and Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. From Italy, Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio. From Switzerland, Johanna Spyri's Heidi. Again, how many of us think of Heidi as a translated book? When we come back to Japanese children's books in a few minutes, keep in mind that these are the first Western children's books that come into Japanese hands. These are the models of modern children's literature to the Japanese, almost always in English translation. The golden age of children's literature really ended with World War I. And I think it's safe to say that newer Anglo-American children's books were also less influential on Japanese children's books for the next several decades as well. So you can keep that in mind in the next section of the episode. My discussion here is also going to become more focused on U.S. children's books. They become more influential. Children's fiction becomes a bit less international in general, at least from an English language perspective. And U.S. children's books are what I grew up with. There were, of course, important developments in the world of children's books. In 1922, the American Library Association started awarding the John Newbery Medal for the most distinguished contribution to American literature for children every year. That American, by the way, is increasingly controversial. The Newbery is maybe the world's most prestigious prize for children's literature. Today, always, it's limited to U.S. citizens and residents. In 1937, the ALA started awarding the Caldecott Medal specifically for picture books, which almost never win the Newbery. By the way, I'm mostly avoiding words like picture book versus chapter book versus middle grade fiction versus young adult fiction today. They aren't relevant until relatively late in our story. They don't translate perfectly between Anglo-American markets and Japanese ones, but I can't avoid them entirely. So I'll give you a very brief explanation right now. Today, a picture book is the sort of book that relies heavily on illustrations. It's usually intended for preschoolers and young primary or elementary schoolers. A chapter book is a step up in difficulty for early readers. In the US, first through third graders or so, they're short chapters, large print, think Nate the Great or The Magic Tree House. A middle grade fiction book is usually what comes to mind when people say children's literature. It's a book written for independent primary or elementary school readers and tweens. Most children's classics that aren't picture books probably qualify as middle grade fiction. A young adult or YA book is for young adults, usually on topics that grown-ups think are too mature for the middle grade crowd. Anyway, the 1950s are when these types of labels started to matter, when people got really invested in the experience of reading a book as a part of a child's education. That's because there was another big shift in publishing for children. The 1950s inaugurated a new era of children's literature. Before we turn to Japanese children's fiction, I want to mention two particular trends in contemporary children's fiction. That's the name for this new era of children's fiction. And yes, I know, contemporary here is one of those broad uses that essentially means within the lifetime of baby boomers. I didn't choose the term. One trend is a growing willingness to address difficult issues, especially issues faced by kids who aren't white, suburban, middle-class kids. In a few minutes, you'll see how this trend, a willingness to address difficult real-life issues, held true in Japan too. Another trend is a growing effort to include more diverse voices in children's literature. In 1975, Virginia Hamilton was the first Black person to win a Newbery Award with her M.C. Higgins the Great. In 2016, Matt de la Peña won the first Newbery Award to go to a Latino author with Last Stop on Market Street. Several Latina authors have won since. Children's publishing has also, slowly, become more open to LGBTQ authors and authors with disabilities. The story of Japanese children's literature looks a lot like the story of European children's literature. You could say that the oldest Japanese children's stories are the Setsuwa, fables, from Heian and medieval Japan that we talked about a long time ago. But just like in Europe, the Setsuwa were stories for everyone. Children just happened to be part of the audience. The Edo period saw a growth of printing in general. Children were especially associated with a kind of printed book called akahon, or literally red book. Akahon were woodblock printed books that dominated the print market between about 1660 and 1750. They often included folk tales. While there was text, the big draw for lots of people, maybe especially kids, we don't know, was the illustrations. Kids liked them, but like European chapbooks, they weren't for kids. They were used as tools to help teach people to read, and gradually, akahon readership shifted from children to adults. The first big revolution for children's literature in Japan is tied to that one major political and cultural change in mid-19th century Japan, the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration brought about radical and rapid social change, and some of the biggest changes to come to Japan were in the realm of education. As you might expect, changes to education mean new norms about what grown-ups want children to read. By 1868, Japan was a comparatively literate country already. It seems likely more Japanese people had some level of literacy than their contemporaries in Europe, and it seems like even Japanese commoners loved books in a way that European visitors noted and remarked on. Lev Mechnikov, a Russian political exile who lived in Japan in the 1870s, related that, quote, "Few are the common laborers, grooms, or rickshaw men who do not hide in their underwear or belts some work of light literature." But the Japanese believed a modern country is fully literate, and Meiji Japan was desperate to be a modern country. I should point out that none of the quote-unquote modern countries with which Japan was then interacting were fully literate. But in 1872, the government of Japan made it official policy that all boys and girls had to attend school, at least for elementary school. This increase in literacy and this increase in promoting literacy created a new demand for books for children. But Japanese writers didn't begin producing original children's literature until around 1890. Some of the earliest Japanese literature explicitly for children was translations from Europe and the US. This is a moment we can return to Meiji-era women. We did an entire episode on Meiji-era women writers in Season 1. There are really fascinating developments for women's rights and women's roles in society in the late 19th century. After the Meiji Restoration, the daughters of the people at the very top of society attended not only elementary school and not only middle school, but also high school. Some of them became the first generation of fiction writers to feature prominently in Japanese culture for about 700 years. Of course, these highly educated women weren't supposed to be writers. They were supposed to be ryosai kenbo, good wives and wise mothers. As you can imagine, being a good wife and wise mother doesn't leave a lot of room for being a great writer. 20 to 30 years of social developments really killed off the positive social developments that spurred that first generation of Meiji women writers. For women born a little bit too late for that brief shining moment for women's writing, translation turned out to be a culturally sanctioned alternative. If women who translate is a topic you're interested in, you might want to pick up a copy of Anne's Cradle, the life and works of Hanako Muraoka, Japanese translator of Anne of Green Gables. It's by her granddaughter, Eri Muraoka, and translated by Kathy Hirano. It catalogs the life of a highly educated woman of the Taisho and early Showa eras who wrote and translated for children. It's extremely informative. I'd like to point out that Meiji-era translation was fairly creative. Today, translators are at least expected to preserve a certain fidelity to the text. Judy Wakabayashi at Kent State University, though, describes a different status quo 150 years ago in Japan when translation included, quote, domestication, omissions, additions, and changed endings, and they were supposed to, quote, make the foreign more familiar and acceptable to Japanese children and the adults who read along with them. When we start talking about Japanese children's literature written in Japan for Japanese children, you can divide that literature into two periods. And this is a division I'm taking from sources at Japan's National Diet Library. The age of Dowa and contemporary children's fiction, which, like in the Anglo-American world, means children's fiction beginning after World War II. Dowa is a category of children's writing made of poetic and figurative language, often in a fairy tale world. It's often aimed at younger children, picture books, or the younger-aged readers of middle-grade fiction, and it came into its own in the 1910s and 20s. That's when educational reformers began to demand products specifically targeted to Japanese children. Dowa saw some of its greatest successes in literary magazines. We talked a lot about literary magazines in a different episode from Season 1. In Japan, magazine publication became serious business in the Meiji and Taisho eras. There were several Meiji-era children's magazines. Shonen-en, or Children's Garden, launched in 1888. It was followed by a handful of other successful magazines. The Meiji-era children's magazine par excellence was Shonen Sekai, or Children's World, edited by novelist Sazanami Iwaya. Iwaya wrote the tale that is sometimes regarded as the Japanese language's first modern story for children, A Dog Named Kogane, in 1891. The first recognized Dowa children's story was Akai Fune, or Red Boat, by Mime Ogawa. You might have caught the word shonen in both of those titles. Shonen is written with the characters for few and years, but it's most often translated as boy, as opposed to man. But the Meiji era is also the origin of shoujo media targeted at girls. In Meiji Japan, the concept of shoujo most obviously evolved at girls' boarding schools. The end of the Meiji era saw the first magazines explicitly for shoujo. Magazines like Shoujo Kai, Girls' Circle, or Shoujo Sekai, Girls' World. I also want to note that writing for children didn't just show up in these children's magazines. Many women's magazines carried stories for women to read to their children, and these stories were often translations from foreign stories. For example, Jogaku Zashi published Frances Hodgson Burnett's Little Lord Fauntleroy between 1890 and 1892. It was translated by a female translator named Shizuko Wakamatsu. The first translation of Beatrix Potter's The Tale of Peter Rabbit to appear in any language besides English was in a Japanese farming magazine in 1906. The story didn't include Potter's name, and in an example of that creative style of translation, it called Mr. McGregor Grandpa Mokube, and it described him as more fearsome than red and blue ogres. As in Europe and the US, the 1910s and 20s closed the first great age of children's literature in Japan, the great age of the Dowa. Kenji Miyazawa is maybe the most fascinating author of Japanese children's literature from the Taisho and early Showa periods. the 1910s and 20s, even though his genius wasn't really recognized at the time. I'd like to do an entire episode on Miyazawa, maybe later this season. Miyazawa's The Restaurant of Many Orders, Children's Stories from Iatov, was his only collection for children published during his lifetime, and it was mostly ignored. Iatov was a fantastic version of what is now Iwate Prefecture in the Tohoku region, where he lived. Today, he is best remembered for the story Ginga Tetsuro no Yoru, Night on the Galactic Railroad, or Milky Way Railroad, which he finished in 1927, but which wasn't published until after his death in 1933. Broadly speaking, the Pacific War was a low point for modern Japanese writing in general. No surprise it was a low point for Japanese children's writing. Keep in mind that Dowa literature is supposed to teach children moral values. In the 1930s, in Japan, those values would be the values the Japanese state wanted to encourage. Things like patriotism, martial enthusiasm, loyalty to the emperor. Nevertheless, there were some excellent children's books to come out of the mid-1930s. I want to mention one book in particular that found itself banned in the later 30s and 40s. That's How Do You Live by Genzaburo Yoshino. The novel is a coming-of-age story for 15-year-old Copper. It's mostly episodic, but the central external conflict is the rise of bullying by older students at the school judo club in the name of school spirit. The bullies insist that the way they're treating the younger students is necessary because, quote, once they enter society, students with no love of school will surely become citizens with no love of country. People who don't love their country are traitors. Therefore, we can say that students who don't love their schools are traitors in training. Again, it's remarkable to me that Yoshino was able to publish this book in 1937, and I'm not the only one to note this. Nevertheless, many Japanese people fondly remember How Do You Live as a childhood favorite. The post-war period saw a flowering of new magazines for children. Two of the most popular were Red Dragonfly and The Milky Way. In the early 1950s, publishers also began to issue a new series of children's books called the Iwanami Children's Library, a collection of classics and contemporary children's fiction from abroad. The books not only entertained their intended audience, but they inspired a new kind of children's literature in Japan. That inspiration helped lead to the end of the Dowa period of children's literature. Remember that Dowa had been about imaginary landscapes and poetry, idealized worlds. New contemporary children's fiction was about the real worlds kids lived in, written in prose. And that real world kids lived in is a world that just finished a brutal war. There are two novels credited as the first works of contemporary children's fiction in Japan. One is Satoru Sato's The Tiny Country That Nobody Knows, and the other is Tomiko Inui's Yuri and the Little People. Yuri and the Little People is a rare children's book from this period of Japanese literary history that you can read in English. Jenny Topley Takamori translated it into English in 2016 as The Secret of the Blue Glass. Because it has been translated, I've actually been able to read it, which means I can comment on it, which is nice. It's maybe slower than a book written for an audience of 2000s kids, but it is typical of this new contemporary Japanese children's literature. It's about a little girl in a slightly fantastical situation, but her world is more or less the real world. And she's dealing with the problems faced during World War II, evacuation, food shortages. Japanese literature in English translation has exploded in the last decade. We're still only seeing a tiny fraction of what's available, but Japanese is one of the most popularly translated languages into English today. Nevertheless, there still isn't a lot of children's fiction being translated, especially not the kind of middle grade fiction I've been focusing on today. So I want to wrap up the discussion of Japanese children's literature by mentioning 3 contemporary Japanese writers you can read in English. They aren't the only children's writers you can read in English, but I think their work is some of the most widely read and some of the work that most safely qualifies as children's writing rather than young adult. First, Eiko Kadano. Kadano is a hugely prolific Japanese author. I believe, though, only one of Kadano's books has been translated into English. It's a big one, Kiki's Delivery Service, translated most recently by Emily Balistrieri. As I mentioned, I'm hoping to do an episode on Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli later this season, and I think it's going to focus on Kiki. But I will mention here that Kiki is a series with 8 sequels. None of them are available in English, which I think is a real shame, and which really upsets my 9-year-old daughter. By the way, the most recent sequel was published last year in 2022. Eiko Kadano is currently 88. The next author I want to mention is Miyuki Miyabe. I briefly mentioned her in the episode about Japanese science fiction as an example of a 4th-generation SF writer. A lot of her books are children's literature. Be careful which titles you grab for the kids in your life. Some of her books are detective fiction for adults. I've only read her Brave story, which is maybe her best-known work of children's fiction in English. It's about a bullied 5th grader who escapes into the fantasy world of vision. Brave story was also loosely adapted into a series of video games and an anime film. The last author I want to mention, certainly not the least, is Sachiko Kashiwaba. Sachiko Kashiwaba was born in 1953. That makes her a few years younger than Izumi Suzuki and Haruki Murakami, a few years older than Hiromi Kawakami. She's from Iwate Prefecture, just like Kenji Miyazawa, a part of the Tohoku region. We've talked about the Tohoku region in our episodes about Japan's have-nots and Fukushima fiction. It was the region most affected by the March 2011 triple disasters. Tohoku has remained very dear to Sachiko Kashiwaba's heart. She's lived there almost her entire life, and her most recent translated work, The House of the Lost on the Cape, translated by Avery Fisher Utagawa, is a touching piece of Fukushima fiction for children. Kashiwaba trained as a pharmacist. She wrote part-time until her children were born, and after she started a family with her husband, she became both a homemaker and a writer. Her first novel was 1975's Kiri no Muko no Fushigi na Machi, translated by Christopher Holmes as The Marvelous Village Veiled in Mist. Director Hayao Miyazaki was actually in talks to acquire rights to the story before he made Spirited Away. There are a lot of similarities between the two stories. There were some accusations of plagiarism. That's all outside of the scope of this episode. Today, I'll be talking about Kashiwaba's story, Temple Alley Summer, translated by Avery Fisher Utagawa. Temple Alley Summer debuted in Japan in 2011, shortly after the March 11th triple disasters. I decided to talk about Temple Alley Summer for 2 reasons. First, because it's a fantastic story by an excellent and important writer, translated by a great translator. And second, because, at least a little bit, it's a story about the last 50 years of children's writing from Japan. I'll explain as I go. I'm going to provide a lot of spoilers from the first half or so of the book because they're necessary to get into the meat of what I want to talk about today. I'm not going to give away the ending. I'm not going to give away the story within a story that's central to the book. So when I'm finished, you'll still have many reasons to pick up the novel. The protagonist of Temple Alley Summer is a 5th grade boy named Kazu. He's also the narrator, and the opening paragraph introduces us to his really distinctive voice. I never dreamed my house had a secret unknown to my parents or me, and believe me, when I discovered it, I had no plans to get involved. I am a scaredy cat. Within a few pages, our narrator is peeing out of his 2nd-story window because he watched a bunch of scary movies and he's too terrified to go downstairs to the bathroom by himself. But when he looks out the window, he sees a girl about his age leaving his house in traditional Buddhist funeral garb. White kimono, white sash, bare feet. The only color are these red plastic baubles in her hair. Could she be a ghost? The morning after Kazu sees the girl leaving his house, he arrives at school and discovers he has a new classmate, except no one else realizes she's new, and she has red plastic baubles in her hair. He asks his friend, why is she here? And his friend is baffled. Her name's Akari. You've known her since kindergarten. No, before kindergarten. And Akari isn't even the only mystery facing Kazu. He has also just learned that his street was once named Kimyo Temple Alley, and he's decided to find out why for a school research project. After all, Kimyo is written with the characters for comeback and life. That can't be a coincidence, right? His investigation of the history of Kimyo Temple Alley takes him to the apartment of an elderly neighbor named Miss Minakami. Miss Minakami claims not to know anything about Kimyo Temple, but she'll become one of the most important characters in the book. Eventually, Kazu thinks to write his historian uncle an email. Did Grandpa tell you anything about Kimyo Temple? He did. His uncle writes back, apparently there's a kind of folk religion where people pass a Buddhist statuette from one family to another. The followers might have a temple structure someplace, but they mainly make offerings to the statuette. The idea with the statuette was that if you prayed to it, someone could come back from the dead. The person who died also had to want to come back, but they would not come back to their own family. They would come back to an unrelated family. To top off all of this news, Kazu's uncle informs him that his family has been hiding and treasuring just such a statuette in his own home for several generations. Oh. When Kazu goes to look for the statuette, though, he discovers it's gone missing, and he has every reason to suspect that Miss Minakami has stolen it. Kazu confronts Miss Minakami about the theft, and Miss Minakami threatens to destroy the statuette, if she has it, and she won't say she does. She makes a surprisingly compelling argument, and this is where the book gets into some of its nuanced thinking about death. Everybody in this world gets one lifetime, Kazu, one chance. We all try to live in such a way that we have no regrets. People have to live as if there is no second chance, so they make the most of every day. Now that the statuette is in danger, Kazu thinks he has to confess everything and warn Akari. He tells her he knows she's come back from the dead. She tells him that she's always wanted to be a doctor. Kazu says, you might not be around that much longer. What can I help you do right now? And Akari confesses she'd love to read the rest of a serialized story she encountered in her first life. Here's where we get to the Japanese children's literature. Akari had enjoyed reading a story in a magazine called Daisy. As far as I can tell, Kashiwaba made the magazine up, but it's close enough to the sorts of magazines that really existed for Japanese girls in the 1970s. Kazu finds several issues of the magazine later, and this is how he describes them. On the covers, girls struck cute poses, touching their cheeks with one finger and so on. Inside, girls who must have been famous back then posed in clothes that were once trendy. There was a page of horoscopes and an advice column to a reader who had quarreled with her friend. 3 different manga stories, 3 fiction stories. The people who made the magazine had thrown in a little of everything. The story Akari loved was a serial story called The Moon is on the Left. There was an installment published in each issue of the magazine. Kazu suggests that maybe when the story was finished, the magazine published the whole thing in book form. This is a reasonable guess. Popular serials were often published as books. Kazu gets the idea from manga, where it's even more common, but there are still serials in Japanese magazines and newspapers, and they still get published later as books. It turns out there isn't a book called The Moon is on the Left. A friend eventually clues Kazu in that the next course of action is to call the publisher. It's fun to imagine a relatively clueless 5th grader doing all of this to help a friend. He does, and it's realistic because Kazu stays very much in character. He calls the publisher and finds out that Daisy shuttered in 1975. The publisher now considers it the forerunner to their manga magazine Chocolat. This, too, is consistent with real Japanese literary history. There are far fewer fiction magazines today. Japanese children and people in general are much more likely to buy and read manga magazines. The publisher offers to send Kazu issues of Daisy with the story, but he finds out that Akari has already read all of the story ever written. The story was never finished. There's only a message to readers that the story is on hold due to the author's circumstances. Kazu also learns a few things about the author. She was an aspiring mangaka, or manga artist, but her career never quite got off the ground. Again, historically realistic, there were very few female manga artists at the time. The editors claimed her cartoons weren't quite right for Daisy's audience. The editors encouraged her to write a story and illustrate it instead. Kazu was able to find copies of every published installment of The Moon is on the Left. He reads and loves the story, and he passes the copies on to Akari. The reader gets to experience The Moon is on the Left, too. It is very much in the tradition of Japanese stories heavily influenced by Western fairy tales. It actually reminds me a lot of the stories written by the 19th century Scottish writer George MacDonald. And it is completely different than Temple Alley Summer, both in tone and narrative voice. I think that's quite an accomplishment, not just for Sachiko Kashiwaba, but also for translator Avery Fisher Utagawa. I'm not going to spoil The Moon is on the Left, but I will say that there is a lot of thematic overlap, and it develops the main plot of the novel. I hope everything I've just mentioned explains why I think Temple Alley Summer's sort of side quest about Japanese children's literature is so fascinating. We get to see how children's literature has changed between Akari's first lifetime and Kazu's, and really that's a glimpse into how much children's literature has changed during Kashiwaba's lifetime. We get a behind-the-scenes glance at those two moments in Japanese publishing, and we get to see examples of two different kinds of Japanese writing for children. I don't want to give away any more of the book, but I think it's clear that Temple Alley Summer has a lot to say that's worth a look for readers of any age. And it's also quite a page-turner. We still don't know how The Moon is on the Left ends, if the characters get to find out, if we get to find out, and we don't even know if Akari is going to get to finish her second life or not. How many children's books leave an existential threat like that hanging over a character for more than half the book? So why read Japanese children's literature? As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Japanese children's literature is full of great stories for everyone. I've truly enjoyed Sachiko Kashiwaba's stories that are available in translation. Kiki's delivery service is a delight. And children's stories are the source material for some of the most popular or important anime movies coming out of Japan. Buying and reading translated children's literature also clues publishers in that English readers are interested in expanding what's available. As we've discussed, there's been a real boom in Japanese fiction for adults in the past decade. With any luck, we might convince publishers that English readers of all ages are excited to pick up children's titles too. I've been reading from Temple Alley Summer by Sachiko Kashiwaba, translated by Avery Fisher Utagawa. Buy your books from our bookshop.org page to support the podcast. You can also support the podcast by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice, or if you're using Read Japanese Literature as a classroom resource, please be sure to let us know. We're grateful to the professors and high school teachers who have been in touch. The very best way to support Read Japanese Literature is through Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Thank you so much to all of our supporters. Find out how you can join them at patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. Love to hear from you about the podcast. There are a lot of ways to stay in touch. Through the website, we're on YouTube /@readjapaneseliterature, Blue Sky @readjapaneseliterature.bluesky.social, Twitter, at least for now, @readjapaneselit, Instagram @readjapaneselit. Thank you to the Japanese Literature Group on Goodreads and the Japanese Literature Twitter community. And thank you, as always, to producer Kime for today's music @KimeMusic and KimeMusic.com.